Natasha Schüll, whose prolific work on digital technologies, design, and the self contributes provocative insights to questions of agency and mediation. Natasha Schüll is a cultural anthropologist trained at UC Berkeley, and currently she is an associate professor of media, culture, and communication at NYU. And she's a familiar face because before moving to NYU, she taught for 8 years in the program in Science, Technology, and Society here at MIT. And she was awarded tenure in early 2015. I'm going to talk about 2 books of hers. One was published, the first one, which was published in 2012, called Addiction by Design, Machine Gambling in Las Vegas. And the book interrogated the role of design from the casino space to the slot machine algorithms in constructing the gambling addiction experience. Drawing on 15 years of ethnographic work with compulsive gamblers and slot machine designers, Schüll shed light on asymmetrical collusions, and I think this is a term she coined, among gamblers and the gambling industry. Her forthcoming book, Keeping Track, Sensor Technology, Self-Regulation, and the Data-Driven Life, from which we will be hearing today, I believe, inquires into new modes of self-scrutiny and self-governance engendered by the growing use of digital self-trackers to monitor various aspects of human life and sociality, from fitness and health to productivity and diet and to emotion and mood. So, parallel to her academic research, which has been supported by numerous prestigious foundations, Schüll has an active presence in national media and the press. The documentary film Buffet, All You Can Eat Las Vegas counts multiple screenings on PBS and numerous film festival appearances. So, please join me in welcoming Natasha.
Thank you for the lovely introduction and for all of you coming. And I'm Theodora, wherever she's sitting, for inviting me. This is my first visit back. I've never been in this room or given a talk over on this side of campus, so it feels new. And I'd like to enter into the material that you heard a little bit about that characterizes my current research by returning to my last book for about 10 or 15 minutes and narrate how I got from that project to my current work on self-tracking technology, because I think it really illuminates or brings to the fore these themes of agency, and in this case, human and non-human agency that are at stake in this series. And it was useful for me to do that. And when I finished up preparing, I realized I'd given short shrift to this question, this specific case of mood, but I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. So my 2012 book is an account of this intimate relationship that exists between design and experience in the case of slot machine gambling, and more specifically how technological innovations starting in and around the 1980s on, and a lot of changes have happened since then, mediates addictive behavior. And I want to tell you a little bit about what that experience is like, specifically the kind of loss of agency that gamblers experience. They describe entering this dissociative trance-like state that they call the machine zone. That's their term for it, or just the zone sometimes. And in this zone, they're so focused on playing the game that things like daily worries, social demands, even sometimes bodily awareness, and certainly a sense of clock time, monetary value, etc. All of that fades away. And this kind of contradicts popular notions of gambling, I think, as a suspenseful, risky, volatile occasion of you're sitting there up in your seat, you're expecting something, you're hoping. And this idea that gamblers are driven by this desire to get something for nothing is really challenged when it comes to gambling addicts, because what they're describing is a quest for nothingness itself, And they describe machine gambling, ironically, as a very reliable, dependable mechanism for suspending volatility, for suspending risk and contingency, and most of all, it came out in the interviews I conducted, suspending the imperative to self-manage, the imperative to choose, to be an agent and to be a vigilant agent. So it's a kind of suspension of agency. And the question that gets asked a lot in this conversation, or the conversation out there in public, in politics, around slot machine addiction, seems to always be this polemic kind of conversation. Does addiction lie inside the device or inside the gambler? And the premise of my book, as I put it forth in the introduction, is that this is the wrong way to frame the question, because addiction is always a relational condition. You can't have addiction without having a relationship between, an interaction between a subject and a particular substance, object, drug, etc. And since most attention in the literature and public discussion gets placed on the gambler side, whether it's genetics, history, did someone, should they have taken more probability classes in school, this kind of conversation. My book goes the other way and says, yes, but there's also all of this other stuff going on that we are just not aware of. So I try to tell the story in the book of all these other agents and actors and affects and the role that they are playing in producing and maintaining this, this state of the machine zone. And I'm not going to go through the whole book, but just to give a sense of the different registers on which this happens. One, I couldn't resist putting this up, because here we are in architecture and design. Passageways should keep twisting and turning through gradual, gentle curves and angles that smooth out the shifts in directions. The idea is that you're already getting someone in the zone before they sit down, and you are taking decision-making out of the equation, because making a hard right perpendicular angle would require an agent in a way that a curve in a carpet does not. Architectural decisions, this woman sort of clutching her purse, she's apprehensive. This was drawn to illustrate a bad kind of casino design. The element players avoid most when gambling is expanse, and there's this law of space elimination, an actual law of casino design, which dictates bringing down the ceiling, making things jumbled and cozy and cramped so that you can just get into your own protected sanctuary for play. And that is actually their language, this language of protected sanctuaries. And then once you're at the machine, here's a whirlwind sort of covering a lot of these features. Bill acceptors, this allows you to get money into the machine, a lot of it, and play off of credit, so that you're not stopping and putting coins in one at a time. Again, which requires some kind of agency, or even if it's just gestural, right? And so you forget about it and you play off credits. More recently and more commonly today would be just player cards, and you can even go into the zeros, or like credit cards. You put that in there and you just play. Also electronic push buttons. So these allow you to just rest your hand and touch with the fingers. So this is still the gesture that's used to connote slot machine gambling, but in fact this is really the gesture today. And doing this, you can play a staggering on some of these machines, 1,200 hands an hour, which again, just the simple event frequency of that, to use a term from addiction, sort of eliminates the possibility of rational decision making. Buttons save not only time, also physical energy, and so do ergonomically designed consoles. Here's from one of the labs that I worked in when they were trying to sketch out what a console, the most optimally configured console for longer, faster, and more intensive play would look like. And curves, again, were very important. And here is another image of the ergonomic design of chairs. So there's a whole, if you go to these big trade shows, there's whole wings that are dedicated just into the chair technology. Some of it even has haptics in it. And audiovisual engineers apply a kind of sensory ergonomics as well. They will softly pixelate the video monitors and balance acoustic elements. One company's audio director told me that he programs all of the video slots to play all their sounds, and usually it's around 400 unique sound events per game, to play them all in the universally pleasant key of C. So that's the kind of, again, you don't want shocks or jolts. It used to be, cling, clang, bang, and lights everywhere. Now the design logic is that you want to kind of tunnel people in, and so you're using noise elimination technology. You're really thinking about decibel levels and where things are reflecting off of. The most important innovations when it comes to keeping players in the zone are those which lie behind the screen, where game algorithms are computing the outcomes. You can have like the best designed machine and sitting in the best chair with the ceiling height perfect, etc. But people aren't going to stay. That will maybe hook someone into sitting down, but they're only going to stay with the right math. Math is what will make people stay. And here again, I was surprised to encounter the language of smooth curves. One mathematician, and they do have math farms where they're sitting around the table, PhDs in math, and trying out all of these different permutations of odds. And he said, traditional slot machine used to look like this first line, very spiky. You were maybe sitting up in your chair because you would either double or triple or you'd lose everything. But now we have video technology, we have microprocessing, we are able to almost sort of distribute risks across all of these different symbols, and you can bet on multiple lines, and you put in 40 and you get 30 back, and you don't know if you're winning or you're losing. And pretty much whether you're winning or losing, almost every hand gives you the same audio-visual feedback, and you're lulled into this kind of state. And that looks like the top line. This is a line where your money is slowly chipped away at, but you're not really aware of it. And he said, if you think about math as a couch, we want you to be able to recline on our math model, like it's a very comfortable couch. So at all levels of design, architectural, atmospheric, ergonomic, audiovisual, and game algorithmic, all of this work is being done, you could say, to use the terms of this gathering, to reduce and co-opt decision-making agency. And maybe even you could go further and say to provide an escape from agency, which is what the gambling addicts articulate as their aim. Here are just some words before we switch gears here. I wanted to give you a flavor of how gamblers describe that loss of agency. They describe it as a merging between their intentions and the machine's responses. So one gambler told me, sometimes I feel this vibration between what I want and what happens. Another gambler, I get to the point where I no longer feel my hand touching the machine, I don't feel it there. I feel connected to the machine when I play, like it's an extension of me, as if physically you couldn't separate me from the machine. And then I've kind of put these to build, because the next quote departs from this narrative of connection and extension, which is still going on here. There's still a reference point, right? And the most extreme gamblers speak in terms of bodily exit, just exit altogether. Here's a kind of pulling is described. You go into the screen, it pulls you in like a magnet. You're over there in the machine like you're walking around inside of it, going around in the cards. And it's not just the body of the player that ultimately disappears if you're really in the zone, but actually also the body of the machine that sort of withdraws into the background. So even as its console and screen and game processes are very alive and working to enable the zone state, it does withdraw. The machine isn't even really there. It's important in the beginning because you see it, but as you play, the machine becomes less and less important. It starts out the machine, and then it's the cards, choosing which cards to keep, and then it's the game, just playing the game. And it's interesting where choosing comes in, because you think of this as a site of agency, but it's through the choosing itself, accelerated and configured and focused, with all kinds of noise interference put out. That is what really pulls you really into this zone. So it should be clear that I regard the zone as an effect of a dynamic relationship, a relationship between a player who's seeking this zone sort of out of time and space and existence, and then machine design that's built for time on device. And this is the industry's term, and I think it's their version of the machine zone. They use it so often that they refer to it as TOD. Time on device is what people are after. But I want to emphasize that although this is a dynamic relationship, it's not equal. Each partner is coming to the table, or to the machine, as it were, with very different stakes. So self-suspension on the one hand, and to extract maximum rev pack, which is revenue per available customer, on the other. So there's a certain tension there. And in my book, I talk about it, and thanks to the introduction for signposting this as a kind of asymmetric collusion. So by way of shifting to the new directions I've taken post-book, I'll tell you just a couple slides on the last bit of the world of gambling machines that I became interested in, and what had a lot to do with my new interest in self-tracking. And this would be these now quite lively conversations in the world of technocratic policymaking around how to handle slot machine addiction. And it's a sort of spectrum. Is it all you regulate yourself, responsible gambling? Or can we actually slow down the reels? Can we actually intervene in the design of the game itself? Or this other interesting approach. So as increasing pressure is put on states to regulate, this is the kind of approach they're going for. And this approach is to equip machines, or to sort of overlay this self-banking. It's kind of like a quasi-banking self-regulation software that will, it doesn't interfere at all in the aims of the machine to get you to play longer, faster, more, to hook and hold you. It just says, oh, but here you have this, you put in your player's card, you play with this, and you've got this whole little module that encourages these voluntary acts of self-governance. So you can do budget management, exclude yourself from a calendar, personal risk evaluation. You can actually take a test for if you're an addict right there. This is the first of these instruments, and it was called the responsible gaming device. And it sort of sat above the play terminal, and there you could track, monitor, and manage. Basically, time and money were the two things that you were managing. It runs on the same cards, the very same cards that marketing runs on, which is, again, kind of ironic. It's also feeding the customer's data into her own dashboard so she can manage her behavior as it's feeding that data into the marketers, who may be even sending advertisements down to the main play screen. So here's just a little flavor of the different screens you get. You can set limits and all sorts of things, and it isn't unlike banking software. This is called pre-commitment software, technically. And finally, as I mentioned, you can actually self-administer an on-screen addiction evaluation, and then you can choose between different coping mechanisms. So therapy can actually happen right at the machine. So instead of seeking to fix the machine, it's deploying the machine itself as a vehicle for risk management and responsibility, as an instrument rather than an object of governance. And here are some of the things that it's called: control aid, personal navigator, responsibility device. Obviously it's deflecting attention away from the product and onto the person. And that's the asymmetry here, because 100% of the responsibility for behavior management is being placed on the person, really, while she continues simultaneously to be addressed as an object of behavioral engineering. So it's another way of saying this is that she's exhorted to control herself as a consumer sovereign who's in command of her preferences and actions, a sort of homo economicus, but she's being treated as homo addictus. And here's a quote showing how, in fact, this isn't just my fancy economic language I'm pulling, but here we have a site advertising the game plan is consistent with consumer sovereignty, since each gambler has the choice about what limits are appropriate for him and her, and the idea is that it would reduce the likelihood of getting lost in the game. So now I want to step away from the world of gambling devices and turn to this different set of self-tracking, self-modulating dashboards that I've become interested in. And I think those dashboards allow us to look from a different vantage point, but I think with the same richness of view on this set of themes that keeps recurring in my work, between dependency and freedom, escape and empowerment, desubjectification, and the clunky but useful word, responsibilization. And my current project is focusing on a set of technologies that on the face of it would seem to be quite different than slot machines, because they're designed to promote, to enhance, and to buttress agency. Instead of serving the aim of escape, they would seem to serve, as we'll see in a moment, the aim of empowerment. And these are wearable technology, other self-tracking devices, mobile apps, etc. So we're kind of moving out of the casino into the wild, into everyday life, tracking. These trackers are on the body as it moves around, and it's tracking not only the body, but its moods, its movements, its choices, its states. So just a little lay of the land. I don't know how familiar this audience is. I won't ask for a show of hands on who has these things, wearing them right now, but it's increasingly captured the imagination and attention. Venture capitalists and techno startups and mass market consumers. And you'll see that the virtual and physical aisles of places like Best Buy are just chock full of these. This is actually from a year or so back, and it's just 143 devices in the category of distance traveled alone. At the close of 2014, Amazon it sort of launched this specialty shop in wearables with about 800 products. There's a lot more now. And they also put up this interesting kind of pedagogical pitch here, like what is wearables for? How could you use this? How could you integrate it into your life? Why are they designed? They're designed to let you know how much activity you've had, to track how well you've been sleeping. You'll be able to do this and that. So sort of suggesting to this emerging market how they might use it. And as we know, these smartphone giants, Samsung and Apple, as well as Google and Microsoft, everyone sort of has put out their own kind of health and fitness tracking systems. You also find it, and this has been a really rich ethnographic site for me, in the aisles of the Consumer Electronics Show. I've been doing research there for 2 years running, and you'll find things like heart rate detecting earbuds that adjust the musical output to keep your heart rate at certain levels of calm or energy, body fat measuring bathroom scales, electronic skin patches for monitoring blood flow, toothbrushes that make sure you brush long enough and correctly, all manner of gadget like this. And most of all, an impressive collection of wristbands with sensors that log footsteps and heart rate, sleep phases, and more. And I'm just going to talk over a video that I'm going to run right now without any sound, just so that you can get a sense. It's an advertisement for Fitbit, which is really the leader at the moment, showing how your daily decisions can add up to a healthier you. So it follows this woman, as we'll see in a moment, playing in the backyard with her children, and then it's going to segue inside to her office through these sort of imaginary lines to her laptop and her desk, suggesting that consumers can trust this device to capture all this rich meaningful data that is being generated as she moves through her day, and synchronize it. And here we have this guy facing this decision. You know, does he go down to the metro or walk? And he decides to walk, and then he kind of realizes these extra steps. And here we see these concentric data circles radiating out from this runner's feet, sort of illustrating the technical achievement of this consumer-grade signal processing. And then, you know, it closes on the figure of a sleeping woman who's sort of content. She's not anxious about everything. She's been wearing her tracker, and the band will help her to optimize even inactivity. And I thought I'd just, you know, to give you a sort of tour of this technology, go through some of the different things. So we've seen steps, exercise. We ended on inactivity. The Fitbit's competitor Jawbone, some of you may have it on right now, has an idle alert, which also addresses inactivity. So when you sit still too long, it'll let you know. And this little gadget, the Rise back here, this sits in your pocket, and it just simply records the time sat through the day. And at one of the consumer electronics shows I went to, there was the debut of this technology, the Lumo Lift. It's posture technology, and it fastens on your lapel or your bra strap, and it records your posture and then actually corrects your posture through this subtle or not so subtle vibration. Through your app, you can control when you're buzzed, how you're buzzed, and even how intensely it buzzes. So it performs standard activity tracking, but the primary purpose is to regulate the stationary states of sitting or standing. Here's a quote: all about your posture, all about your life. One move changes everything. And the ad ends on this, one of the video ads, a corporate meeting, and there's a woman kind of slumped over and disempowered looking. And then, you know, we don't hear anything, we don't see anything. All we see is that she puts her shoulders back, and she kind of smiles a little bit. And it says small changes can be empowering, and like the others in the room sort of look at her. So all of these mundane little aspects of life are being regulated. Stepping, sitting, and sipping, and standing. Here is Happy Fork. This is designed around the activity of eating. And what it does is monitors and records the length of each meal, the number of fork servings, and the time between each serving. So if it's shorter than 10 seconds, the fork oscillates. So you know to slow down. And I'll just read, you're advised to take about 10 to 20 chews. If you trigger Happy Fork's alarm by eating too fast, don't panic. Set the fork down at the side of the plate. Wait until the light turns green again, signaling that it is safe to take another bite. So, you know, it turns something as routine as this single bite of food into a question of potential danger. And it's marketed as a way to take control of your health. And it also recommends keeping your cell phone in view, although we're hearing everything so much in the media about like baskets on the table to get your phones away during meal time. It should be social and convivial, but here's this woman just communing with her own data. That as she feeds herself, this data is being fed back to her and kind of closes this loop. Here's the data one can examine over time, and then just, if you want to see what these alerts look like, one of the screens, next fork serving in 6 seconds, oops, too fast. And Stephen Colbert, many journalists have mocked this, but it is real. And he called it un-American because its effort was to slow consumption. And then hydration, another mundane but vital act, is the focus of a range of devices like the WaterPal, and that's a small wireless scale that goes on the bottom of your bottle. And it keeps track using built-in flash memory and sensors, accelerometers. It keeps track of how much liquid's being consumed from it. And then it conveys that to your phone, and it will alert you if you haven't hydrated enough. Similarly, we've got a passive hydration tracking model here that uses these built-in sensors to measure how much has been drunk, and it will adjust the daily goals based on temperature that day or the humidity levels. And it provides feedback through flashing lights. So there's different approaches here. Another one changes color from red to yellow to green to signal how close you are to your hydration goals. So as with the happy fork and some of the other things we've looked at, all these devices transfer the burden of vigilance and even to a degree behavior change from selves to sensors and computational algorithms. And I'll return to that point in a moment. Just another set, I said I was giving short shrift to mood, so the next couple that I'll talk about, I think one could classify, you're not self-reporting, stating my mood is X, Y, or Z in these mood categories, but it's about breathing, being calmer, so it's a sort of affective modulation. And here, what is the act? Here it's the act of breathing, maybe even the most intimate of these mundane acts we've been looking at, and most vital. So here's Spire. It's this small little wearable device, and the idea is that if you learn better to regulate your breath, you will then learn better to regulate your stress. And so what it does is it alerts you very subtly through buzzing, and again, you wear it wherever you choose in your body. It has a little stone. When your respiration becomes shallow or erratic, it will let you know, so you can take a deep breath. This is kind of supposed to be a seamless thing. It accompanies you. It's always on. And here's just one kind of thing you can look at. The website suggests, do these periodic reviews, do experiments on yourself. What does your breathing look like when you're working on your computer versus reading a book, meditating, and how can you cultivate better breathing habits. And here's another device that's concerned with entraining new patterns of breath and focus. So that's the Muse. This is a 7-sensor mobile EEG headset. And it's designed to give you a window into, and over time the idea is that you'll get a handle on these intimate signals of your own brain data through this real-time audio feedback and then a dynamic on-screen visualization. So I've used this a few times. One was given to me, and you hear your brain. It went through many iterations. I can talk about it more in Q&A, what design choices were made, what fell away, what was beefed up. But as it stands now, you hear your brain as weather, and it's stormy when you're distracted, and when you're really still and quiet and at peace, a little bird comes and sits next to you and starts to tweet. But if you start to kind of game for the bird, which is very un-Zen, right, to want something and to be attached to it, then the bird will fly away. So they kind of they realized that people were gaming to get the birds, and so you kind of learn, if you want the bird to come and tweet next to you, you can't try, you just have to be still. And then, wind is a cue to bring your attention back to your breath. And this is actually quite different than, in a talk like this, I can't go into the differences, but I see this particular technology as quite different than some of the other ones that we've just looked at, because it's not always on. It's really seen as a sort of meditation training device that you put on for 3 minutes. You can put it on throughout the day or just once in the morning. You could get this neurofeedback, and then you take those lessons with you throughout the day. So see and hear your brain activity, learn how to calm your busy mind. So however it works, it is still about what it shares in common with these others, is that it purports to be about mastery, control, self-regulation, a kind of enhanced agency. So what do we make of all this? So I'm still formulating what I make of all this, but it seems to me that the selves of self-tracking are understood by those invested in wearable technology and also themselves in my interviews with trackers. The question of how actual tracking unfolds, I want to step aside and say, is quite different than what I'm presenting here, which is more the promise and the advertisement and the marketing. But the idea is that the selves are choosing agents, and that they're consumers whose well-being depends and derives from the choices they make. And this is, a distinctly valued and fraught domain of life in our society. Individuals are urged to shape their life through choice. They're urged to be ever vigilant, savvy entrepreneurs of themselves. And yet there's so many different things to eat and exercise types to do, etc. Plus so few resources sometimes that these subjects, although they're exhorted to be self-vigilant and self-managing, often lack the knowledge and the foresight and the resources to do that and to navigate this abundance of potential choices. So I think the wearable tech industry, as I read it, is banking on that double insecurity. The customers that they imagine are really unsure and fearful a little bit, and they just don't know. They're ambivalent. They don't know whether to trust their own senses and desires and intuitions as they're doing things like breathing or eating or chewing, sitting. Again, these really mundane aspects of daily life. And the idea is that people are flying blind through their daily routines and that they need help. And wearables promise to fill in the blind spots and take the guesswork out of everyday living. That's the pitch they make, that they're going to supplement the myopic vantage of real-time experience with this continuous informatic mode of perception. So this clearly is computational mediation and has implications for the kinds of agency that become possible. So this is, I was thinking about this kind of, because they say, really see they're always using these metaphors of the visual, but unlike the clinical gaze, I think it's just a useful comparison that Foucault describes. So the clinical gaze is focusing on the sights and the sounds and the smells of acutely ill bodies. And what's going on here is that sensor technology and big data analytics are attending to the digital exhaust of well bodies. And these are little informational bits whose cumulative diagnostic value could never be registered by the eyes of a doctor in real time. So this is a mode of apprehending and assessing subjects that's happening remotely from the space and time of the body. It's happening in the cloud, not the examination room, and it's an epistemology that concerns itself with this kind of time series data rather than immediate experience, with correlation rather than causation, with patterns rather than events. So while these patterns are rendered when these patterns get rendered into these visually digestible formats like scores or visualizations, or even like 6 seconds to go, oops, too fast. When those little translations are made, this can enhance self-awareness. So this is what one of the speakers of the Consumer Electronics Show, this is how he talked it up. You can build a profile or a picture of what it is you're doing. This lets you see and understand the choices you're making on a daily basis, which is really who you are, the choices you make all day long, whether to take the stairs or the elevator, what you will eat or not eat. And he thought it was important to remain in constant touch with this data profile, and it's been talked about as a data double or an exo-self. So that you can grasp how your choices are impacting you now, how the gauges are moving as you make choices. So he suggested that in this way, personal sensor technology can function as a kind of sixth sense. And what he really means by that is that you will be able to discern these otherwise imperceptible effects of habit, your own habits, right? That's coming from these electromechanical sensors and data processing software. Melanie Swan, I hate this image, it's not mine, it's one that was on her publications, but she uses a similar metaphor to describe this kind of supplement to self-understanding. And she says, this gives us a fourth person perspective. So we've got sixth sense, fourth person perspective. And ultimately, she said this is a new kind of truth. And we could say, for our purposes, a new ground of a new kind of agency, maybe. Or we could say, no, this is just a compromise of agency, or we can't even use that word anymore. I mean, that's up for discussion. But she said, this new kind of truth is, quote, not possible with ordinary senses because it doesn't correlate, it doesn't correspond to a phenomenological self spatially, temporally located, but a kind of database self, a self whose truth lies in scattered points and associations and these dynamic accretions that can only be seen by the machine, so to speak. So we're invited to see ourselves as longitudinal databases that are constantly accruing new content. You are your data is often the refrain. So what's some of the pushback against this? So some scholars who've been looking at this, they say, that this rhetoric of self as database opens this problematic gap between the you of the data set and then the epistemologies by which that data set is amassed and studied and made meaningful. There's scholars, Lucy Suchman and Anna Vizeu, they say the wearable computing is coming on the scene and presenting itself as the only way to bridge this epistemological lacuna that divides the modern body from the knowing and acting self from the agent, right? And that it's presenting itself as the only way to really know yourself and bring physiological fact into the grasp of the experiencing subject. That was a quote from their analysis. You could say that maybe they're presuming too readily a certain definition of what agency is in order to make that criticism. But here I thought I'd read for you something that speaks just to this attitude they're talking about, which is an advertisement from Samsung. What if you could ask your body questions and listen to the answers every minute of every day? You could adjust your habits according to your body's advice. Imagine the insights gained, the mysteries unlocked. It would change your life. So here the body, it isn't this sensing organ through which you're gaining self-knowledge, but it's this data generating device that you've got to hook up to sensor technology and analytic algorithms in order to know it. So here's Suchman and Vizeu again. This is a body that's continually emitting signs, albeit in forms inaccessible to the self, that might act to maintain it. So this question of whether technology, this kind of technology, is empowering or disempowering, buttressing agency or eroding it, is a point of debate among tracking enthusiasts, among some of the designers of wearables. And this emerging group of designers, and I've really seen this only in the last year of researching this. I've been looking at it for about 2.5, 3 years now. This emerging sense is that we can and should do more than actually just track people and give them self-knowledge and perspective on their choices. We should guide their choices, quote, in the fashion of a thermostat. So there's sort of one step further being taken here. And the idea is that this technology shouldn't only track wearers, but keep them on track. And this is behind my title, Keeping Track, which I think speaks to a broader phenomenon than just self-tracking technologies per se. So the idea is that these technologies would interrupt the flow of experience and prompt you as needed to eat or pee or meditate, etc. And it's pitched as a way to then, so how does this fit in with what I began with, which is these are different than slot machines, these are empowering people, it's about mastery, it's control. Well, yes, but how is that mastery being presented? And whose mastery is it? It's kind of offered as a way to embrace the project of self-enterprise and consumer sovereignty, you could say, without undertaking all the tedious, nebulous, anxiety-provoking work of lifestyle management that anyway you could never do on your own without the technology. So it's kind of, these devices are presented as digital compasses for modern living is how I think about it. And they help you with this. They help you sort of tune in to how small daily decisions add up to big results. And she's really happy that this thing is tracking her and taking care of her. So it's self-care, but it's also being cared for. There's a quote from another designer and longtime self-tracker, and she says, we're on the brink of really exciting things. Devices that will give you actionable updates before you need to ask. She said, I don't want to track, I want it to be done for me. Insert a chip in my mouth, have it record my calories. So the consumers that device managers are now imagining, this potential market out there, is this market. The consumers who are not actually aspiring to autonomy, but wishing to outsource autonomy, wishing to outsource the labor of self-regulation to this personal sensor technology. And here you see the mother, which almost too nicely captures this externalization of responsibility. It's billed as whatever you need, whenever you want. So it's a kind of all-knowing mother who will intercede to quench your thirst before you know you're even thirsty. This is the way it works is underneath this top row, you see these many little white things. So those are referred to as cookies. So the mother is the main station, and she just kind of sits there. And then you key these little 5 devices to your pillbox or your faucet. So it's kind of an Internet of Things, but it's also tracking you on your keys and all of these places where that might slip through the cracks during the day, taking medication, etc. Your mother will help. So just leading up to some kind of provisional punchline, I think that there's been a lot of talk in the past decade or so, and just reiteration of this story of the contemporary world as characterized by this regime of anticipation. We're in this neoliberal present where we are expected to regulate ourselves. The welfare state is retreating. We are asked to have this constant stance of alertness as a kind of normative affective state. But I think the words of this tracker and designer, please just put the chip in my mouth and record the calories, and then technologies like Mother here suggest that the consumers of wearable technology are quite desperately looking for a way to relieve themselves of the work of anticipation, that's part of the story, or at least to share the burden. So it's not evident that these are tools of responsibilization, equipping people to take care of their own welfare. They would seem actually to position users as desiring not to be in charge, and it's presented as a solution to that desire. So these are not the kind of active choosing selves, these are passive choosing selves. And you could imagine a kind of future iteration of that Fitbit advertisement that I showed, in which the protagonist, who gives herself over to this carefree backyard play, that she won't only trust the devices to track and collect and store all of her information and data, but to keep her on track, to interrupt her and prompt her when an algorithmic analysis of her own real-time data deems it necessary to eat or drink or sit or rest or stand. So I'm going to end on this image and leave things a little bit open because my own thinking around this is still forming. But I just want to say this injunction to self-manage through tracking and its nudging technology, it's not, just leave you with the idea that it's not a purely autonomizing formula, but that it falls somewhere between enterprise and submission, responsibility or agency and discipline, and we could even say that it's constituted by those tensions. So I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natasha. So I wonder if there are any questions after this course.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, very good talk. Can you talk about the role of time interval? So all these tracking metrics that you talked about are pretty short compared to a lifetime, right? So we're interested in steps in a day, or whether you got up in a very short period of time, or how many bites you had. Maybe it's because they're more verifiable or more consumerizable, but why are there not sort of longer, humans have lots of cycles, whether it's a fertility cycle for a woman, where I've seen some wearable devices sort of playing in the market, but it's certainly a big economic market, but that same communication and that same engagement hasn't been successful. And do you think there's something about the shorter time period, the shorter time interval that relates to like gambling and satisfaction and meeting these needs that sort of makes longer term goals harder to manage in the same way?
Well, I think partly it's because the material I chose to focus on here were these sort of really elemental, you could say, building blocks of agency, drinking and breathing and just being an organism in the world. But I could have focused on a whole lot of others, which are more about monthly. I mean, there's, I see Maggie's in the audience. She can certainly speak about the fertility tracking apps out there, and tracking sleep patterns over a couple of months, and does it relate in doing sort of different experiments. And if you go to quantified self meetings, they kind of poo-poo this idea that you're going to immediately get your Fitbit, and that very day you'll be learning things and seeing things about yourself. Because if you really want to learn something, you'll be seeing how many steps you took. But there's no correlation there. There's no sort of self-understanding, really. And their idea is that you put these devices on, you kind of set up the sensors, and then you let them run for a while. Just very similar to online poker players. Never check at the end of the session, how much did you win or lose? Traders, doesn't matter. We're talking about the law of large numbers here, and you've got to let it build up, because only when it accretes to a certain point does it have any value. So when one guy I talked to thinks of himself as a time series self. So actually, as I elaborate this material in the book, it's going to be more focused when it comes to actual tracking practices on that longer durée. This is sort of a product of just put it on. But I will say one more thing, just because I didn't put this last slide, and I did kind of want to get to it. So this is called the think. Does anyone know what the think is? So this is a pretty radical departure, I think, from a lot of this other stuff, because it's there in the aisles of the Consumer Electronics Show alongside self-tracking technology. It's in dialogue with self-tracking technology, but it's sort of not tracking anything. It's doing something to you. It is keeping you on track. It's sort of the outer limit of this kind of mother model, where self-reflection drops away altogether. So there's no real insights to gain at all. And they explicitly, the CEO explicitly says, the problem with Muse and Fitbit is that it's giving you all this data and telling you to go change yourself. And why do we need to do that? If I can put this on, and so this is Calm Vibes, but there's also Energize, so it's called Vibe, and you choose Energize or Calm. It's FDA approved, and it's been shown in all of these studies that it is like drinking 2 cups of coffee or taking a quarter of a Valium or something. And the idea is we're already doing this with coffee and other things. Why not just put it on your head, keep yourself on track? Why do you need to look? So it's sort of the outer limit.
But it doesn't track anything.
No, and there is no data to reflect on. There is no time interval isn't a question. Of course, when this gets in the hands of quantified self people, it could be sort of hooked up with a whole set of experiments. When I use the think, do I sleep better at night? So let me track my sleep to see and record that I've used the think. So it sort of can be networked in, I think, but it is not tracking anything.
Thank you for a fascinating lecture. I wonder if you could reflect again upon the connection between your first area of study and your present one, in the sense that I wonder what are the similarities and the differences between the game technologies and the tracking technologies, because it seems that the game technologies are into the same kind of business as the tracking technologies of finding out how do people behave, what are their habits. But then there's a kind of evil will behind wanting to lead people even further down their bad habits, whereas the tracking technologies, maybe the results are the same, but they are then presented for the person herself, so she can be conscious about her bad habits and then maybe get rid of them. But then on the other hand, is when these technologies are becoming more present, don't we then maybe enter up in a new addiction? I mean, do we become addicted to them in the same sense as game players become addicted to their habits and these technologies leading them into their habits and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I'm trying to find just the perfect answer to this. Let me just pull it up here. Okay. Here we come. So, part of the reason I didn't narrate that I got into this project was that it had become just disheartening for me to spend so much time thinking about this sort of this evil control, and I was still interested in tracking and the technology and the design and these questions of agency, but I just couldn't do it anymore. Like looking at, now they're tracking gamblers in real time and giving them different odds to find their pain point. It was just too much. So I said, quantified self, and I felt like I was beginning this project with a fresh slate. But then as I started tracking out of quantified DIY sort of settings into Best Buy and Consumer Electronics Show, the story started to shift and change a little bit. And it came into starkest relief when I found myself in the Las Vegas Convention Expo, which is where the Consumer Electronics Show is held every year. And it's the same expo center where I had been going for literally 15 years to track. So I knew all the corners and where the plugs were, and it was like a familiar landscape, but there was just a different overlay of technology there. And if that didn't feel odd enough, then I found myself on this panel with this guy. And oh good, you haven't seen yet the name of the panel. So it was called Trackaholism, a disorder worth having. What do quantified selfers and the obsessive compulsive have in common? We learned that diligent tracking produces positive results, but there's extreme barriers to growing this movement. How can we duplicate the behaviors of the trackaholic, etc.? In the future, trackaholism will become the norm. And as they were talking about this, they were gesturing physically toward the Las Vegas Strip. And they were saying these slot machine makers have really figured out this question of attention retention. We need to do what they're doing. And they could stand up there and say that because they didn't have the same sort of public image problem that the casino industry would never stand up there and say, like, trackaholism is, let's be more addictive. But there was this kind of happiness, and they were saying, we check our cell phones 150 times a day. Let's check our Fitbit like that much. How can we make it that grabby? And the idea was that if you poured it over from the Las Vegas Strip or from Candy Crush or from Facebook, these same techniques, and just slapped it on top of digital health, that you'd solve the problem. And I guess, and people have since come to me from those industries and online education. Can we use the same kind of reward structures and gamify this for good ends? Like, have you ever, Natasha Schüll, thought about applying this knowledge you gained, that you're really good at doing these things that we need to do, in online education or digital health? Have you ever thought about using this for good? And my immediate reaction is just to feel kind of creeped out. But I don't think that's not an adequate reaction, because it is a question of, maybe it's a question of that there are best practices out there. ways to set up a game or a design interface in a way that is better than others. When you're talking about better just as a sort of function of flourishing and well-being. I don't know that I want to be involved in that conversation as a maker or a designer, but so I'm just speaking back to your question, not exactly answering it. But yes, I've thought a lot. These loops to my prior project just keep coming back and coming back. Yeah, Maggie.
There's one question.
Thank you very much. I think my question goes maybe a little bit in the same direction. So I was very fascinated that the gambling addicts developed a common language. So they use the same expressions, and I wonder whether you expect or whether you have encountered already these kinds of common language also coming up with the tracking technology.
Well, the thing with slot machines, and the reason that I was drawn to it, one of the reasons I was drawn to it as an object of analysis, is that these machines are not that diverse. They all have seats and a cabinet and a screen, and maybe the buttons are a little different on one than the other, but it's really, and even the odds, they're at a certain point, there's limited flexibility and manipulation of the odds. They're working within this really constrained design space, and they're also channeling people in a kind of homogenizing direction. So I always remember back when one day a whole lot of my transcripts fell on the floor, and they got out of order, and I had to kind of shuffle them back. And it took me quite a long time to parse the pages so that the CEO who lived in Summerlin, which is a very posh gated community in Las Vegas, that his pages and his description of the machine zone were not mixed in with literally the welfare mom of 5 who was gambling her milk money. Because the words they used to describe this zone were so similar. So it was a sort of anti-sociological moment, maybe, or maybe it was a sociological insight of sorts. Here you have this technology that can take such difference in life experience and channel it into such similarity. You don't see yet that kind of homogenizing, because it's all over the place. The happy fork is it's about eating and chewing, and it's vibrating, and then the other thing is sitting in your pocket and buzzing, and then you've got a water bottle that's glowing. So it's sort of all over the place. It's less constrained and homogenizing. So I don't see that yet. There's nothing like the machine zone. But people do talk, the vocabulary is there about when their tracking becomes a kind of runaway, has a sort of runaway, and that they're very often I'll hear from people that in order to reach the 10,000 mark that they're going up and down their stairs in the winter at night, or they lose sight of why they're tracking in a similar way that gamblers aren't aiming to win, they're just aiming to continue. So it becomes kind of autotelic in the same way.
I was just wondering if you had done any research about Pavlok, because I think that's an interesting example of using extreme measures in order to break bad habits.
Yeah, so Pavlok, does anyone know what Pavlok is? I always have one, and when I go start a class on self-tracking, and I kind of pass it around so the students can use it, and it's just this object of delight, strangely, and everyone just gets really giggly around it, but it goes on your wrist, and you self-shock, and it's quite startling. And what is his name again? I'm forgetting his name. Manish. He's gone back to all of these early studies on self-shocking that became historians too closely associated with the kinds of things we see in all these movies are out now about the Stanford Prison Experiment and the experimenter, and some of these studies that were using self-shock for things like homosexuality, and that his argument is that this got a bad taint, but it's actually incredibly useful and compelling, and I don't think that there's anything, any studies that would maybe count in the scientific literature yet, but there's a huge amount of anecdote on his website from people that, try to stop cursing or eating something, if they just simply shock themselves, that behavior will reduce. So it's a self-behaviorism. I mean, behaviorism is one of the kind of ingredients on this table of self-modulation, and that most perfectly captures it. It's like you're setting up your own little Skinner box on your wrist.
I wanted to thank you for a very interesting and enlightening talk. It seems to me that whenever we're asking these machines or tracking devices to guide us, there's a big question about, are we going to use their guidance, or are we going to tell them what we want and they're going to help us achieve it? I mean, it's one thing for it to say, it would be good if you hydrated more, or if you hydrated less. But maybe that day you just want to drink, you're starving, and if you drink a lot of water, you're going to feel full longer enough, and maybe you want to lose weight, or maybe it's inconvenient to drink what's available, you're in a foreign country, etc. So I think there's a big, important distinction to recognize between your specifying what you're looking for and it helping you achieve it, versus it guiding you. And I would say that any type of addiction, trackaholism, speaks of giving up control to the machine. It puts us as the rat in the maze that is being guided. I mean, these checkout lines where go over there to stand in the line and go back and forth 3 or 4 times, I find a bit dehumanizing, but not a big problem. And I could just imagine that this fellow or someone like him who's pushing addiction to being tracked also realizes, at least someplace, that if advertisers could get the slightest toehold in this guidance phenomenon, well, they have a lot of money to make. I mean, I don't know what society would become, but so we have to be very careful, I think, about this, and I'm really glad you're following it with the insights you presented.
And there is the literature that is on this so far in social sciences has focused mostly on this privacy aspect and what is going to be done with this data. And I think that's an incredibly important thing, and there's good people working on it. So I'm trying to kind of carve out this space of thinking about how does it make new selves and change our attitudes to ourselves, and how does it relate to broader regulative shifts. I mean, we could have a discussion about how this is like the person level version of nudge. This is apparently Cass Sunstein does have a term for that, snudge, but this is the self-nudge, right? And that this is reflecting this kind of governance that is based on the idea that we are not rational, that we don't always know what we want, and that we should set up our environment using the defaults that will produce the better outcomes, therefore opt out of health insurance, not into it, and all of these other things. And it's a kind of encouragement that we do that for ourselves. But I agree with you that that kind of reflection about setting up one's own parameters is happening more in settings like quantified self, where people have the resources and the knowledge to do that and to design their own algorithms. You see it falling away as it moves to Best Buy, where it's mass market and the algorithms are set, and you know how many steps you take is normed to these big population-wide kind of statistics, and the self does fall out a little bit more, and it does start to look a little bit like what you fear. So that's partly why I want to track tracking from inside quantified self out and see what falls out. And if quantified self is something like an ethics of the good life, which is how it's very eloquently articulated by practitioners, does the ethics fall away when it kind of moves out to Best Buy?
If these devices were guiding us and maybe hypothetically guiding us in the best possible direction, does that mean all of us should go in exactly the same direction? What's the distinction between people? And then there's a higher question, what is life and what is living? If everything is being decided for you and there's a light pointing left, right, up, down, etc., stop, go, so I think there's that issue too.
Right, I mean, the whole figure of the mother, like what would Winnicott say about this, right? That, you know, a good enough mother is the one that lets you wait a little while when you're thirsty and gradually expands the time so that there's a gap between your needs and fulfilling so that you learn to fill that gap yourself. And so what happens when we're kind of reeling back that whole proposition of development? I think that's a great question.
Thank you.
One last question.
Thank you. I wish so much I could have been here for the whole thing, but I just this video. So this is such important basic questions about that we can influence. We can influence some of the good news of. I was shocked, pun intended, when I heard about this self-shocker risk, but it was in graduate neuroscience courses, and with these studies that are going on, new ones being added every month. And some of the good news is something like problems with the brain because of injury or because I was also a full-time chemist until I got sick. It was just you don't have HVAC to pull out the chemicals and I was breathing it in. And that was as an adult. However, the kids, we have 8,000 chemicals in our daily environment. All gasoline, all that stuff. It's finally catching up with us over years as adults, but the kids are eating potato chips with cottonseed oil, with all that pesticide. It's not just a matter of preservatives, it's poison. It's concentrated in cottonseed because it's not a food product. So there are pieces of information that when she said, well, I should put a chip in my mouth and to track the calories, I'm more concerned with, is it going to be tracking some chemicals? There are children that are benefiting from this shocker that news to me was headbangers. They have severe brain damage, often from sports, too early, before 12. Just went to a 6-hour thing a couple weeks ago at BU, and they got a 5-year grant to be studying more of the athletic superstars. They started with 150 football players, stars. And how early they started? To make a case for not the head smashing football early. So head banging is very damaging continuing. So the shocker thing in a small little pieces has been shown to help.
And I guess I'll just respond to one point you made there about the cumulative nature of these things we're ingesting, this kind of invisible poisons and sort of bio load of these different things. I think that follows along with a lot of what we saw is being regulated today, because this is part of a shift from the burden of healthcare and sickness in our world coming from acute bacterial infections to lifestyle diseases and the chronic. And just as each step we take or each burger we eat or each bite of burger can be sort of bitified in this cumulative story of poisoning of some kind or diabetes or all of these heart disease, they all relate to these everyday choices. And I think that these could be expanded out to not be just measuring the behavior that the consumer is taking, the chewing and the biting, but also these cumulative burdens of what are we ingesting.
I think we asked many questions, but I think there was one more question. Am I right? Okay, that could be you.
Thank you.
So I guess I'm curious about this digital health industry thing. So if they want to have more consumers, one thing they can do is play the long game and hope that people will go to Best Buy and advertise. But another way this industry could grow might be to go through doctors and have them recommend this to their patients to sort of create this market. And I was wondering if in your forays and in your fieldwork you found this happening, that doctors were prescribing this to patients and sort of to grow what's nicely called the digital health industry. I was just curious.
Yeah, so the digital health industry is sort of health and daily health and fitness tracking that you can kind of do for yourself. Then there's the insurance companies who are investing for their own reasons, and we've heard a lot about that in the news. And then there are doctors and hospitals. And they're a huge presence at the Consumer Electronics Show, and there's a whole 2-day non-stop stream of the Digital Health Summit, and many of the summiteers are doctors who are, in the manner of like Eric Topol, kind of promoting this vision of data-driven medicine and self-tracking driven as well. And some of them have even hired sort of on-site, not just IT people, but tracking IT people, so that you would go and you would get on exit from your visit, and you would get a special cocktail tailored to you of what sort of range of tracking devices would help you. You'd have like a consult, and then you'd be sent home with a prescription. So that's the holy grail, as the doctors see it, that all of these devices will fall under prescription at some point. Thank you for the great questions.
Thank you.